Ladd's Addition, you all know this, right? You're Portlanders, you've been there. You understand this wonderful, historic, leafy, lovely neighborhood. So I promise you, this is the most text that you're going to have to endure. And many of these dates you know, but I highlighted this timeline to indicate really what are the pivotal years, the pivotal events in the development of Ladd's Addition. So obviously William S. Ladd, entrepreneur, visionary, businessman of all stripes, investing in a number of different enterprises in the early days in Portland. He was mayor actually when he was like 26 years old in like 1852. So here's a man who came to the West to seek fame and fortune, which he succeeded in. But there were some pieces that need to fall into place before what we know today as Ladd's Addition came to be. And that, of course, were bridges across the river. East Portland was its own incorporated city from starting in 1870 up until 1891. The streetcar network, the electric streetcar network, essentially extending across the river on a number of bridges that were built in the 1880s and 1890s, really developed the east side of Portland. And William Ladd, obviously seeing an opportunity, this was late in his life. He was in his 60s. He had Ladd's Addition platted, not surprisingly, at the same year that East Portland was annexed, incorporated into Portland. So 1891 is a pivotal year, as well as 1905, of course, was the Lewis and Clark Expo, igniting a building boom. I think of early Portland, the 2 decades of building boom in Portland, 1905 to 1915, generally kind of the heyday of the craftsman boom, and 1920 to 1930 period revivals. We see the period revivals throughout the city. Do you hear those dogs in the background? I hope you don't. Anyway, there are dogs upstairs. They're not mine. Okay, so there's Billy Ladd with his neatly trimmed or not so neatly trimmed beard. You all know certainly about the fact that he was really, of all of the entrepreneurs, all of the very successful capitalists in Portland, probably one of the most successful and best known. He started the first bank in Portland, the Ladd and Tilden Bank. And of course, downtown, he built this very commodious, highly visible mansion, which of course is long gone. I think it was gone actually before the end of World War II. And you will recognize the carriage house. So imagine what the mansion looked like. Looking at the carriage house, you can imagine that the mansion was equally ostentatious, equally grand, equally elegant. This chap down here is his son, William Meade Ladd. And doing research, you have to be very careful if you're running across a reference to William S., who was the father, or William M., who was the son. This little World War II troop carrier actually was named the William M. Ladd. Now, just to kind of put you in context, to bring you sort of into the context of South Portland, here, of course, is Ladd's Addition. We'll take a closer look at this amazing, they call it orthogonal. And basically, I think, I'm no mathematician, but that means that everything actually is very symmetrical. We have the north-south, the east-west. We have these diagonal lines coming in. So everything makes either, is it a 60-degree or 120-degree intersection? And of course, we have the Ladd Circle in the center with the 4 nodes, the rose gardens, right, surrounding. So as frustrating as it can be driving in and out of Ladd's Addition, it really is very logical. It's very symmetrical. You just have to keep in mind that the streets, unlike most grids, are not just north, south, east, west, but they're coming in on a 45-degree diagonal as well. So you all know that, and it probably had some experience finding your way into and out of Ladd's Addition. Here's an aerial photo from 1919. What's interesting here, just to orient you, this is north, this is Lone Fir Cemetery, here's Hawthorne, here is 20th, and over here is 12th. And down below, we can just barely see Division Avenue. Here's Ladd Circle, here are the Rose Gardens. notice that even by 1919, it was not all built out. There were still a lot of vacant lots. Primarily, most of the early building took place on the north side of the neighborhood. And do you know why? Streetcar coming down Hawthorne, so people could literally walk to the streetcar and be in downtown Portland in minutes. So what I find interesting looking at archival photos of old East Portland is here we see the architectural landscape that we still see today. These photos are from 1910, 1915, like that. Here's a little Model A, I believe. But what's so striking is we don't see a tree canopy. The trees were planted at the same time the houses were built, which is kind of interesting to think back on Portland as a booming West Coast city. People were just clamoring to buy lots and build houses without the tree canopy. I mean, think of Laurelhurst, think of Eastmoreland, think of all of our leafy, lovely neighborhoods, which are pretty much identified, or we identify. We don't necessarily think about it, but what would Ladd's Addition be without this wonderful arched tree canopy? I mean, it's just so much part of the neighborhood. Not to overlook the shrubs and the flowers. And here, of course, is one of the rose gardens. So the natural and human-built landscape is really a defining element, certainly for Ladd's Addition and for much of East Portland. So here we have, of course, Portland is Rose City. And it was given that name early in the 20th century. The Rose Festival, this kind of rose symbol, the icon of the city of Portland, the Rose City, and we see it here, of course, in the neighborhood rose gardens. So I can't, Scott, how do I get rid of that band across the top so I can see my caption? Is there any way I can douse that? I can't quite see the caption. Anyway, it says Craftsman. Can you see that? I can't see it. Maybe you can see it.
Yeah, we can see the text, or at least I can.
You can see it. All right.
You can use your mouse and kind of pull the slide down or up.
I can pull the slide down. All right. Okay, Craftsman, people, right? Craftsman, you're urban tour guides. You know this. This is one of the charming features that absolutely captivated me. One of the reasons I moved to Portland is this incredible fabric of Craftsman architecture, the exposed carpentry, these wonderful little idiosyncratic elements that carpenters were developing, they were using, they were seeing them in plan books, they were seeing them in catalogs. They'd been around on the West Coast. The Craftsman movement really hit the West Coast in the 1890s, early 20th century. And you can see from San Diego all the way up to Vancouver, BC, this wonderful fabric. These are modest sized houses. These are in some cases, working class houses, bungalows, first home for many people. But we see this wonderful, as I say, this exposed carpentry, the brackets, the exposed rafter tails, the wonderful distinctive windows. Just absolutely a delight for people who like this kind of thing. Look at this little Craftsman, or this little bungalow, I guess, because this was my point. It's not strictly a Craftsman. Actually, it looks rather colonial. Central entry, evenly spaced windows, matching gables, and a pedimented portico. I may mention this again, but you all know what a pedimented portico is. We see it on Greek temples and Roman temples, right? And here it's on a little bungalow in Ladd's Addition. Variety, texture, exposed carpentry, shingle cladding, multiple surfaces. Sometimes you'll see stucco, sometimes you'll see brick. And I learned after the fact, this house is not a 1915 Craftsman. It's a 1915 Craftsman revival built in like 2010. It's such a wonderful replication of the Craftsman aesthetic that I was fooled. This is a relatively new house. So it certainly fits into Ladd's Addition. We see this fabric from north to south and east and west. In the neighborhood, we see some more high style evocations of the Craftsman. We see some period revivals, but the essential aesthetic, to my way of thinking, in Ladd's Addition is the Craftsman appearance. Here we have the exposed rafter tails. Now here's one for your vocabulary. I don't want to make assumptions. I know you all You all know some architectural terms. You're walking tour guides, but you use the term battered for a tapered column. I mean, it is tapered, but use a fancy word now and again. You know, people are impressed by that. Here we have a very low sprung, almost a Tudor kind of arch with the battered columns, the exposed rafter tails, this little shed roof dormer. Absolutely charming, right? Craftsman, two-story craftsman, two-story American Foursquare, little craftsman here, part of the fabric, part of this amazing fabric in Ladd's Addition. Look at these. These are not bungalows, my friends, right? There's no way you'd call these a bungalow. 2.5 story, 2-story finished attic. These are craftsman influenced, craftsman inspired. The owners, the people that live in these buildings appreciate the historic character. I'm going to talk about the National Register here shortly, but I wanted to include a slide of the interior. And you've probably seen this. If you've either lived in, owned a Craftsman, you can see this openness, the accentuation of natural light, lots of windows, a nice flow from the foyer into the living room, into the dining room, kind of this openness, which is very much a departure from the almost rabbit warren feel that you get in the Grand Victorian, the Grand Queen Anne, or an Italianate or French Second Empire. The Craftsman was modern architecture in a modern community for modern American families that all went hand in glove. Look at this one. Now this today is actually kind of obscured. It's kind of hard to see it because of the foliage. This was designed by a chap named Albert Faber. And so I'm sure, well, I think that he sort of said, well, if a little craftsman is good, then a lot of craftsman is great. Look at these outrageous brackets. They're decorative. They're not holding up the eaves. This wonderful barge board here, this fascia would not collapse without these brackets. But it's just like, it's like Craftsman on steroids. Look at the size of these compressed columns and this huge fascia with a slender little keystone element. Just an absolutely marvelous Craftsman. And we have real Columbia River basalt and probably Washington State sandstone. Just a lovely building on the north end of Ladd's Addition. Some of you may have seen this. And what I call, and we'll see this more of this wonderful sculpting effect. Sculpted fascia, sculpted brackets, sculpted rafter tails, exposed carpentry. Now here's an interesting, this kind of a West Coast story. These two houses were built by a developer named Mert Donahue. He also happened to be the vice president of the Miracle Pressed Stone Company. When you see the term pressed stone or permastone, you know what it means? Concrete block. So from a distance, this looks like cut stone. You get closer and you see that the rustication is all a very regular repeated pattern. So these are concrete blocks made to look like stone. Again, I think both of these actually are Mert Donahue. An interesting piece, he was the developer builder, is that most of Ladd's Addition were built, most of the houses in Ladd's Addition were built by contractors, developer, entrepreneurs that were building, many of these homes were built on spec. They were speculation homes. The city was absolutely booming. One of my favorites in Ladd's Addition, this is an Alfred Faber. It's got some Gothic, it's got some Craftsman, it's got this amazing kind of massive presentation here. Look at this rounded kind of open porch balcony with the balustrades. And what do we call the tapered columns? I can't hear you. That's all right. They're battered columns. And these exposed beams, again, this kind of exposed carpentry. Elegant middle to upper middle class houses with the Craftsman aesthetic. These were white collar people who were commuting to downtown Portland and living in what was to be lovely leafy Ladd's. Now, excuse me, National Register. This building here, I've got a close-up. You see this little funny, kind of flimsy little metal plaque? It says the Jesse Beckley House, Ladd's Addition Historic District, 1909. So what this plaque indicates is that this house is contributing to the National Register District. And I kind of glossed over that in the timeline, but Ladd's Addition was one of the first conservation districts in the city of Portland It was the first residential district on the National Register of Historic Places in 1988. And interestingly, as you walk through Ladd's Addition, certainly in the last year or two or three, you don't see stop demolishing Portland signs. You don't see infill. You don't see teardowns because the National Register District designation protects the architectural integrity of the neighborhood, house by house by house. American Foursquare, right? You see this everywhere in Old Portland. In fact, they're so ubiquitous. Is that redundant? They're ubiquitous in Portland. And because of that, realtors call these, hang on, there's realtors in the audience. I know what you like to call this, Old Portland. Or even worse, pardon me, Old PDX. They're American Foursquares. Yes, we see them all over Portland. Yes, they're part of the Craftsman story. Yes, they're part of the boom, the post Lewis and Clark Expo boom. And we see them as a sign of Portland emerging, these neighborhoods emerging, these middle class, pretty homogeneous in terms of socioeconomic strata, but very diverse in terms of the architectural styles. A classic American Foursquare, two-story cubic mass, hip roof, centrally placed hip roof dormer, evenly spaced second-story windows, full width open porch, and off-center, asymmetrically placed entry door. That is the hallmark of the American Foursquare. You'll see variations on it, but this is a great example of that quintessential Pacific Northwest American Foursquare style. And here we have more American Foursquare. Not so much the Craftsman, a little more of a kind of maybe a colonial feel, but you see two-story cubic mass, evenly spaced windows, low-pitched hip roof, centrally placed dormer, and here is a gable roof, centrally placed dormer. So a little variation on a theme. Foursquares, another great Foursquare. Look at these exaggerated overhanging eaves. In fact, I've seen some people actually see some prairie style influence. And of course, prairie style was contemporaneous with the popularity of the American Foursquare all over America, by the way, Midwest, particularly in the Midwest. Midwest to the mountain states to the West Coast, the American Foursquare, again, a great example, symmetry above and asymmetry in the window, in the door placement here. And by the way, you recognize this? That little plaque indicates that this building contributes to the architectural character of the National Register District. Again, a wonderful developer initiative, developer variation. This was and is a duplex, and yet it still fits in to the single-family residential character of Ladd's Addition, which is what William S. Ladd had intended. He wanted this to be a neighborhood for what he called the proper people in Portland. So these were solid middle to upper middle class houses, and the multifamily would kind of sneak under the radar, although they wouldn't have used that term back then, obviously. But here's a duplex. So there were some duplexes. There are a few churches in the neighborhood as well. But by and large, it's a fairly homogeneous, highly desirable, close-in, public transit-oriented neighborhood. And that was what William S. Ladd had intended. And you all would recognize this house, this grand colonial, right? We want to call this a colonial. Two-story pedimented portico with metopes and triglyphs and ionic columns, right? We see the triglyphs and the metopes in the horizontal band here. We might call that the entablature. There's our lovely dental molding, right? You like to remind your charges when you're out walking around in downtown Portland and you're looking at the courthouse, you're looking at one of the early 20th century Beaux-Arts buildings, bank buildings, point out the dental molding, right? Now, try this on. Pull all of this eye candy off, right? You have a two-story cubic mass, symmetrically placed windows, central entry, but it's basically, the mass of this is a Foursquare. It's an American Foursquare with a lot of lipstick, right? I mean, it's just a fabulous building, highly visible, built by the owner of the East Side Lumber Company in 1911. 1911, 1912, 1913, friend, architectural historian colleague of mine said that more building permits taken out in the city of Portland in 1912 than any year up to that time, and maybe since. Period revivals. We can't talk about Ladd's Addition architectural fabric without addressing the period revivals. This, of course, is a mission style house with this signature, this curved parapet. You see this little step up and this rounded piece on top. It's a projecting parapet. Think Alamo, right? Think Missions, think Southern California, all the way up to San Francisco. So this is a mission revival, the style very popular in Southern California, made its way up the coast, became popular in Portland. You'll see them sprinkled into the historic neighborhoods, typically 1920s, not so much, occasionally before that. I think that actually this was pre-1920, but clearly influenced by the popularity of Southern California mission, Spanish colonial, Mediterranean revival. You can use all those terms, and obviously a very, what should we say, spacious house here on this highly visible corner lot, just literally around the corner from that great colonial revival 4-square mansion that we just looked at. So again, this incredible variety of architectural influences. Here we're seeing a little bit of Tudor, which would be kind of reflective of that arts and crafts influence coming out of England in the mid 19th century, the arts and crafts movement, from which was spawned the craftsman era in the West, in America in general, and then all the period revivals that kind of complement that, the Tudor revival, the Gothic revival, and so forth. So here's a cute little, a term that I learned on the West Coast. It was just a very simple little, almost like a Cape Cod. But look at this lovely bump out, these cross gables, half timbering. Look at this wonderful stone surround. That's not permastone, that's real Columbia River basalt. This lovely leaded window. So people, I've heard realtors using this term storybook. So storybook. There's an architectural historian who's looking a little bemused. What in the world is that? What is that all about? Actually, I find them charming. I love the storybook. English country cottage, English cottage, Tudor, that all fine. But storybook has got a little more flair. Hey, storybook, look at this puppy. What do we have here? We got an octagonal entry, like a little turret, a tower here. We got a decorative fascia. We got these round medallions. We got an arched window here, another arched entry. This broad, flat chimney. It's a modest little house, and I don't know. You could call it Tudor. I like storybook. Look at the mailbox in this little statuary niche. What's that all about? Why not? Portland, right? Portland whimsy. Keep Portland weird. I don't know. I think it's a Portland thing. I think this diversity and variety of lifestyle and architecture is kind of it's a West Coast thing in general, but particularly in Portland. A relatively nondescript Tudor revival. I'm showing it here because talk about colorful language, and I know you like to use colorful language with your 12-year-olds or 10-year-olds. What do you have? Fourth graders? Scott, fourth graders on these urban tours? Probably?
Third grade.
Third graders. Well, okay, so they're still young enough to be able to be wowed. All right, you got one. Here's one for you. It's a clipped gable. Yeah, okay, clipped gable. It is. It's clipped gable. It's a jerkin head. Yeah, it's a jerkin head roof, and it's a sign of craftsman, arts and crafts Tudor. You will see that. It's just a little signature, just like exposed rafter tier.
That's what happens, Kerry.
Wow, I'm getting all sorts of feedback. Scott, are you there?
Yeah, I'm looking into that.
All right. I'm fine now. I'm not hearing it on this end.
Yeah, we had it.
Tudor, twin gable, the Tudor swoop. Now, I didn't take that out of an architectural dictionary or glossary, but I call it the Tudor swoop. And you will see this. These gable ends, these cross gables, are slightly asymmetrical, and we have a rounded entry. This is the hallmark of these Tudor revivals. You see them all over East Portland. Think of Peacock Lane. because the basic mass of this house, pull this stuff, this lovely cross gables and the lovely multi-pane windows, etc. Pull it off, you got a Cape Cod. Basically, it's a Cape Cod mass, Cape Cod floor plan, and it's been kind of prettied up, kind of, made distinctive with the cross gables, multi-pane windows, rounded entry. All right, we're going to look at some churches. Those of you that know Ladd's Addition will recognize this as the Maronite Church. It was originally the first evangelical Christian church, and it looks like this lovely stone kind of medieval fortress with the Gothic arched entry and the Gothic windows and the bell tower. And come to look at it closely, some of you may know where I'm going with this. This is not Columbia River basalt. It's not Williston sandstone. It's Miracle Stone. Probably Mert Donahue sold them the concrete block. It's all concrete, folks. Everything that we see here, essentially, all the the fascia, the facade is concrete. We have a lovely rose window in the center, which would be very typical church architecture, but the exterior skin is concrete block with repeated rusticated patterns on the exterior. Yep, there he is again, making his way around Ladd's Addition. Here's another picture of it. Lovely building. In many ways, a very typical kind of Gothic revival church building. But in 1909, with the new technology of this, well, it wasn't new technology, it was ancient technology, concrete. But by the early 20th century, the synthesizing, making the concrete that allowed it to be used for decorative and not just strictly structural purposes. So I like to call this the quirky church part of the walking tour. This one tucked into the south, east central part of the neighborhood. The first Italian Presbyterian church, 1926. On my walking tour, I say, all right, people, what do you think this was? And they say, well, maybe a library annex, maybe a school. How about a fire hall, right? All those kind of plausible. This church building was built as a church for the Italian Presbyterians. I don't know. There's a story there with St. Philip Neri, this huge Catholic community, and Roman Catholic Italians in the south end of Ladd's Addition. Who were these Italians? Renegade Italian Presbyterians built this church in the 1920s, and it's got a bell tower, no bell. It's got the tall windows in the sanctuary. It's got kind of a neoclassical entry. Is it Art Deco? Is it international style? Is it, look at these lovely, these glossy black medallions, these porthole windows. Just a really striking building, fascinating building. I have no idea who the architect or builder was, but hey, it's Portland. It's the 1920s. We can do our own thing, right? Speaking of doing your own thing, here's the I.M. Sanctuary, currently the I.M. Sanctuary. It was the new Christian Swedenborgian church for the Swedish-American immigrants in the area, built in 1924. And the angels are not original to the building, but pretty much everything else that we see is original. We see the low-pitched hip roof with these exaggerated overhanging eaves, ribbon windows with these piers with the planters on top. I don't know how you would ever water a plant up there. But what do we see here, friends and neighbors? What style is this in this Swedenborgian church from 1923 or 4? Prairie School. It's considered prairie style. So we have the compressed second story and then the horizontality, all the elements that we associate with prairie style in this funny little church in the heart of Ladd's Addition, just down the street from the first Italian Presbyterian church. And now we have a remnant. This building still stands. It was the St. Philip Neri Church and School, 1914, designed by Joseph Jacoberger, very important architect, came to Portland in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, was European, trained in Europe, and came to Portland as things were booming, and he was very prominent go-to architect. So here he's designing something that really has. We're going to get a close-up, a little better look at it. This is the building today. Sadly, it's no longer a worship space. It's been carved into office space, but the facade is still here. It needs a little TLC. But what do we have? All right, let's first. At first blush, I'm looking at the triple arch, the ionic columns, the dentil molding, the horizontal cornice. So that's kind of classical, right? Diamond pane windows. It looks very classical. And yet it's got these exaggerated exposed brackets, and you can't see it, but here's a very geometric presentation of glazed terracotta, blue and green, which turns out that's a signature. Joseph Jacoberger used that as his architectural signature. So it's really a blend of classical and craftsman influenced architecture. Just a very interesting building. And we can see in that, what if I can go back there? I bet I can. We can see it, basically, it's unaltered, you know, and it's lost a little bit. I think the canopy is gone. But it's, you know, we can see that when it was built in 1914, this would have raised the eyebrows of the tradition of the church traditionalists. I mean, this was something, you know, variation on a theme, because we got the round arches, we got the colonnade, etc. But what in the world are exposed rafter tails, exposed purlins, right? And look at the bell tower up here with this exposed carpentry, which we saw in the arts and crafts, the craftsman houses that we've seen earlier. So that same aesthetic applied in a religious context. And again, Joseph Jacoberger, who designed a number of residences, high-style arts and crafts residences. And he also designed the rectory, which again, you have an opportunity to take a closer look at it. A very interesting mix of traditional and modern. Here we have an arched entry with a keystone, but very geometric, almost kind of a herringbone or basket weave pattern to the brick. And when you walk by this, it's just north of Division. You'll see it. Here is a little oriel window, O-R-I-E-L. These are terms that you can share with your charges when you're doing your walking through. When you see an oriel window, shout it out. It's cantilevered above the first story. It's basically a bay window cantilevered out above the first story, and the fancy name is oriel, O-R-I-E-L. Man, from a blend of modern and traditional to 1950, it's a 51, I guess, Pietro Belluschi, St. Philip Neri, the new St. Philip Neri Church. This is the rear, but it's a nice shot. It shows the Campanile, I guess, the bell tower, which is very traditional. But look at this monoplanar minimalist massing that was so mid-century modern, for which Pietro Belluschi was probably he's probably our star architect. Well, we got a couple star architects, but Pietro Belluschi would be one of them, who designed a number of churches just before he left in 1951 to take over the dean's position of the School of Architecture at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. It was a plum job, and he had built a reputation with buildings like this, really advancing the whole aesthetic of less is more, of modernism. Here's the interior in the sanctuary, and this is very typical of Belluschi. He's got lots of natural light illuminating the sanctuary. The rest of the sanctuary without lights on can be quite dark. Here, kind of a very traditional, almost a neoclassical look to the inside, the interior. We do have a kind of a coffered ceiling. I just heard someone. There are people out there. So last slide, second to last slide. The Mizpah Presbyterian Church, 1891. It is the oldest building in Ladd's Addition, just barely. And I don't know if it really counts, because it was moved to this site and then converted into a 3 or 4 unit apartment building. But we see the exterior, of course, according to National Register guidelines, the exterior is still intact. It looks like, you know, a Gothic Revival church, but it actually is an apartment building. Oh, here we can't talk about Ladd's Addition without the wonderful little what was originally the Ladd Grocery, built back in 1928, 29. Now it's the charming Palio Coffee Shop. And here again, look at what we have here. A little mission parapet, red tile roof, mission parapet. It's classic Mission Revival, a Mission Revival grocery in the heart of Ladd's Addition, just off the circle. So there we have it, my friends and colleagues. It is 11:10. I did pretty well. And there is the Alfred Faber Mission Revival House. And I'm Eric Wheeler, historian tour guide with Positively Portland Walking Tours. Thanks for joining me. And I've got time for questions. If you have questions, I'm still here for, I don't know how much of a residuum we have left, but Scott, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I think we can let people unmute themselves if they have a question before we wrap things up.
Sure.
I have a question for you, Eric. There was one slide that you showed of a house you said was one of your favorite houses, and the house number was 1819, but I don't know what the street was. It had the curved porch. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
What was
That one. No, go back.
That one?
You've already gone past it.
There it is. Oh,
There
That
you
one.
go.
That one.
Yeah, it's on Ladd.
It's on Ladd.
Yeah, I believe it's Ladd. It's one of the main. Yeah, there's Ladd and Elliott. It's on Ladd.
Okay, thank you.
It's pretty easy to spot. And that is that's an Alfred Faber, and I believe it was built for a member of the Atiyeh family, as in Governor Atiyeh.
Oh,
I think so. I think it was one of a big family. They had the carpet business, right?
right.
Yeah, the Atiyeh brothers. So it was one of their, one of the nephews, etc. So yeah, it's a lovely house. And it's really an amalgam. It's what I call Portland fusion architecture. It's got touches of a number of different stylistic elements. What I really like, I love how this balcony echoes the curve of this projecting patio. Isn't that something? I mean, so a very conscious rhythm, a balance to that the architect included.
Well, to me, it looks like we'd have drainage problems. I don't know how they get the water.
Yeah, I don't know. I have spoken to the owners and they love it. Love the house.
Hey, Eric, there's an interesting comment by one of our members, John, who was talking about the church, the Bellucci church that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And he said they had to retrofit the confessionals
Huh.
because I guess they forgot to include that in the design.
Oh, that's interesting.
John, if you're there, if you want to add on to that.
yes, they did. Yeah, I'm looking at where I was married. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other comment about the water is that Ladd's Addition was built over the Hawthorne River. And they never bothered to do anything but just build over the river, fill it in. And so in the wintertime back in the 70s, when it rained, as it does in Portland, you got a free swimming pool in your basement.
Cool.
Oh,
Good to know that.
huh.
Something to be aware of.
Now, we lived on Hemlock, just south of Harrison.
Sure. So this neighborhood. I mean, you've seen how it really, in many ways, has not changed since your childhood, since your early adulthood, right? I mean, it basically looks the same. I mean,
No, we were just back there to drop something off for one of my wife's friends who lives there, and nothing had changed.
Yeah. And the whole National Register issue is it's often somewhat controversial. but for people who choose to live in a historic district, in a historic neighborhood, and most people that live in the old Portland neighborhoods choose to, it does provide a sense of continuity, a sense of community, a sense of space and place that is something that I think most Americans really value. So it isn't just the architecture. I mean, it's like the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Does that make sense? It's like the shops nearby, the bus lines, the walkability, the bikeability, all those things play in. So I see the architecture as an important part of that, but it's just part of it. But then when you mess with it, when you know, and this has happened in Portland, there've been tear downs, and then infill, you know, it does have an impact. And not that I don't think it's desirable or possible to freeze everything in time, but I think the general character of a neighborhood, whether it's a mid-century modern neighborhood like Reedwood or like Argay in the east, or an older neighborhood like Laurelhurst or Irvington, I think there's something to be said for preserving the architectural fabric of the neighborhood. So that's one of the things that's so charming about Ladd's Addition, because it's distinctive in that weird, you know, that weird, funny, angular street pattern, and yet there still is the, you know, that continuity of architecture and tree canopy. It's really quite charming. All right, other questions, Scott? You're kind of in charge of the microphone, sort of? You pass it around, figuratively?
I was just gonna hand things over to Karen. If there are other questions, you know, people should feel
There's
free to jump in.
Karen Neal has her hand up.
Oh,
I'll take my
There she is.
hand down them first. I lived in the Ladd's Addition for 10 years,
Uh-huh.
like 79 to 89, and unfortunately, not in one of those gorgeous homes. And I think it was either a home that had been removed or the side yard of one of the large homes. I was surrounded by all these gorgeous homes. I was renting a small home there that had been built probably in the late 70s. How did they allow something that's
Yeah.
not very cute and not very much didn't fit the architecture of all the surrounding? How did that happen?
Karen, it's important to point that out, and I sort of glossed over. There's been some infill. There are some like 19, I would say 50s, 60s, 70s infill. Funny little, like a brick ranch, right? It's right between two craftsmen. The short and simple answer is that there was no, up until 1988, there were no restrictions. There were no design guidelines. There was no landmarks commission that proposed additions, whether it be a porch or a garage, had to approve. So it is interesting to put oneself in the mindset in the 1950s, when you would see like a new ranch home coming in on what was probably a vacant lot. What did the neighbors think? Did they think, oh, how inappropriate to have a single story rambler, ranch home next to these lovely antique craftsmen and arts and crafts? Could have been, they said, hey, it's great to have a modern looking house in the neighborhood. It's great to have, a young couple moving in or whatever. I mean, it might have been a completely different response than we see in places like Eastmoreland or, other neighborhoods where people, or Selwood. Look at what's been going on in Selwood. Lots of tear downs, lots of infill. So a very different kind of perspective from a half a century ago. So to answer your question, it got built because there was no reason not to build it. I mean, I'm sure they had to, every building had to pass certain codes at the time. The 1950s codes would be different than the 2020 codes, but there was just no standard for design or for appearance. So yeah, there are a few. Actually, it's interesting you point that out, because I noticed them too. I mean, they do kind of stand out, because you got this great craftsman period revival streetscape, and then you'll see a funny little, like a 70s ranch, with what looks like T111 siding, or even aluminum siding or, vinyl siding. And so those, by the way, are listed as non-contributing resources. In fact, I was working with some neighbors last year. They were updating the criteria for contributing. And because that nomination was recorded in 1988, that's a few years ago. So actually, through this review, there were more buildings included based on our perspective from 2020, looking at what's historic and what's not. But your little 70s ranch probably is still considered non-contributing. You said 1970s single story, right?
Yes,
Or
I did, and it
thereabouts.
wasn't very attractive.
Yeah.
Pardon? Yeah, thanks for your answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions for Eric? Well, it doesn't sound like it, but Eric, I just want to tell you appreciate so much that you were able to join us, and it gave us all just what we needed to end our year and look forward to hopefully touring in the future.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'll give you a hand and hopefully be
Oh.
joined by, we
Well,
still have at least 50 people. So thank you very much.
thank you, Karen. It was my pleasure.
All right. Well,
Eric, if you would unshare your screen and maybe if you showed your face just for a brief moment before you left.
I think I'm there. Or am I
No.
not? Am I not there?
No, he's there. We can see you.
I think
I
I'm
can't.
there.
See you.
I see
You're
myself.
small.
Well, stop sharing. Now, Eric, you've taken, now we see you, but stop sharing, Eric.
Stop sharing.
And
How
then,
do I
and then
stop
we'll be
sharing?
able to see more.
Go to the top of the screen.
All right.
Or for those of you that remember what I showed you, just move the slider bar. You'll see more people.
All right.
I
All
can't
right.
do it on this, on my
How do I
iPad.
do that? I see it green. Boom, 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 boom. Pause share.
Stop share.
Oh, stop share. There it is. Oh my, look at all those smiling faces. You thought we should put everybody to sleep. But you're walking tour guides, right? You do this stuff, don't you? You do walking tours, right? Most of you?
yes.
We do, but we don't do residential areas.
Oh, you don't?
So there's a lot of information that you presented that we don't necessarily know about.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
I guess that's good. I do have a question for you. Do you see me? I see myself.
Mhm.
Are you able to see me? Not that it matters, but yeah, it sort of matters.
Oh, there it is.
What are you going to do about downtown walking tours? Did you have any question about this?
Yeah. Good
Eric,
question.
you really have to ask that question.
I do. Yes, I do. Because it's really an important question. I'm a walking tour guide. What am I going to do with downtown Portland?
Yeah, that's been our year-long dilemma.
We'll let you know, Eric.
In a year.
Well,
If-
it's
In
Yeah.
a year.
cold. We're hoping to get back.
We'll keep you posted.
And
Okay,
we
so
see-
you do your
Thank
tours
you.
only in the school year? You only do them for school groups during the school year?
in fall.
Yes.
That is,
The fall. Okay. Well, the fall will be the fall. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, things could change dramatically by the fall.
There's a parent.
we are certainly hoping so.
Yeah. Let's hope. All right. Thank you all for your.
There was somebody with a hand up.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
what's that? Was there one more question?
Oh,
Look in the top corner of your
Yeah,
screen,
there's
Karen. You see somebody with a hand up.
they all have their hand up.
I have a hand up, but I didn't mean to have a hand up, but now that I am,
There-
I can actually say what I wanted to say, which was, thank you, Eric. It was a fabulous program.
Oh, well, thank you.